Hello and welcome in to the Fog.net podcast. My name is Michael Swain, the Kansas beat writer for 24/7 Sports. Really excited about the podcast episode we have coming your way today. We are joined by Kevin Flaherty, a national writer for 24/7 Sports and a KU football expert. We're going to talk to him about all things Kansas football. We're going to talk about our biggest storyline heading into the season. Then we're going to draft the position groups, go through and pick and rank them all and see where we stand. And then we'll kind of wrap up with some big picture thoughts on Kansas football heading into the season. Fall camp, of course, is set to start on Tuesday, August 2nd. Players report on Monday, August 1st. So football is right around the corner. Kevin, how excited are you for the return of football season? Recruiting is slowing down, so football's back. How excited are you?
Well, it's funny because I feel like Lance Leipold talked about how the end of the season really propelled them, through this offseason. But from a fan standpoint or somebody who wants to see, what's next for Kansas, it's been a really long wait since that game against West Virginia. And so as much positive talk as there has been, as much development as there's been physically, you and I both went out to camps and saw the players, and kind of how the bodies have changed a little bit. I'm pretty excited for them to actually get on the football field and talking season be over and get ready for actual football season again.
Definitely. You mentioned it. It's talking season, and we'll kind of put an end to talking season here maybe today as fall camp gets started and things get really hectic. But I want to start here, Kevin, and then we can do the position drafts in a second. What's kind of your biggest storyline heading into the season so far?
Well, I think, and this may sound strange, but I think it's the confidence level that Kansas has, whether it's the coaches that you talk to, whether it's the players, whether it's certain players' parents that we've run into. I feel like even over the last, 2010 until now, the dark ages in Kansas football, if you want to call it, there have been time periods where people have kind of said the right things, like, oh, we're moving in the right direction, things like that, but you haven't felt the confidence, right? Like it's felt quite a bit a lot of times like, well, okay, you're saying this now in, May and June, but what happens in that first game when things aren't going your way, when you fumble? Is everybody still confident, or is everybody kind of still hanging their head and, saying, here we go again? And I think one of the interesting things, and you had such great coverage of Big 12 Media Days, one of the interesting things that Leipold talked about there, I thought, was how big the Texas game was, not in terms of them winning necessarily. Obviously, that was big. But in terms of the fact that to that point, I think they were 1-8. They had very little to play for. They're not going to a bowl game, and so it's tough when you have that going on with your team. It's very easy to lose your team, for them to say, hey, we're going into Austin, we're going on the road, there's not really anything to play for it, and you go there and you lose by 30 points. And the thing that he seemed most pleased with, maybe even more than the win, was the fact that these were guys who could have bought out. They could have checked out, and they didn't. The fact that they showed up and played the way that they did and were rewarded for it, I think that all three of those parts were really important. The fact that they showed up the way that they did, the fact that they were able to win the game. And I think that helps the coaches too, because of the fact that the coaches are able to say, see, look, like when you do what we're telling you to, when you execute like this, it does pay off in the win-loss column. And so I do think there's a higher level of confidence I can remember, maybe since, Turner Gill took over. And so I do think that that's something that I've noticed maybe this offseason more than in previous off seasons.
Definitely. I think you picked up on that confidence a little bit at Big 12 Media Days.
Sure.
And I think there's a intersection here of the level of confidence, but also I think being realistic as well for what this team could accomplish. I think you look at the roster still in a rebuilding process of trying to get the right players in for the right scheme for what Brian Borland wants to do on defense, Andy Koldenecki wants to do on offense. And I think for me, my big storyline going into fall camp is how does the depth pan out? Because I think you look at the two deep and you feel really good about your starters on both sides of the ball, being able to compete at the Big 12 level and being able to keep things competitive. But how often are all 22 of your starters available to play every single snap? That doesn't happen very much, right? Football is very much a war of attrition over the course of the season. So for me, I look at depth and how do some of these young players come along over the course of fall camp, first few weeks of the season, to where maybe when kind of those injuries and nicks and bruises start to happen midway through the season, are those guys ready to step up, right? I'm sure we'll talk about some specific position groups here in a second, but for me, the depth is the big question for me because you like what you have at a lot of these positions at the starting position, but then you go behind them and it's a question of, okay, is this person young or is this person old, but should they really be at this level, right? Playing for a Power 5 football team? That's kind of the question I have. But
Yeah, and I think, you make a good point in that there was a lot of talk about this transfer class that was a
yeah,
top 25 transfer class nationally. And I think that when you look at it, it's not just the transfer class for 2022, right? Because
no,
most of these guys are multi-year guys. And so when you look at it from that perspective, I think there are probably some players that maybe aren't going to hit the ground running for whatever reason. They run into some, maybe it's injuries, maybe it's they just didn't quite pick it up quickly enough. But in a lot of ways, that transfer class isn't just for 2022. We're talking about 2022 storylines, but I think a big part of 2022 is building toward 2023. And so that's where a lot of that comes in too, building depth, and long-term depth and finding
hmm
out which guys are good enough to play at this level, which guys are good enough to start at this level. And obviously everybody wants it to pay off in terms of them winning a lot of games and all of those things. But, you know, Nick Saban built Alabama the way that he did, on the process and getting a little better every drill, a little bit better every practice, a little bit better every day. And I think one of the things that's been encouraging about this staff is the fact that they do have that short-term view for the long-term view of, okay, like we get you want to, go out and win Big 12 titles, but how about you do a little better on this bench press
yeah.
rep than you did yesterday? And that's really how you build an effective program.
And I think they've talked about that a lot, right? Getting 1% better every day is kind of
Sure.
being the mantra. And I thought it was very interesting too, like the idea of belief, right? You look at this roster as a whole, it's won one Big 12 game over the last 2 seasons. And you mentioned that Texas game earlier, right? And the idea of building belief over the course of time, I think, is something that the staff has worked really hard with. So let's move into the position draft. And
Sure.
because I am such an incredibly gracious host, I will let you go first and talk and draft your first position, Kevin, with the number one overall pick here. Who are you going to take?
I think I will be taking my talents to the running back room. I think that's kind of the easy number one pick with
Yeah.
Kansas, right? Because not only do you have production and proven production, you have two running backs who went for over 700 yards last
Yeah.
year in Devin Neal and Kai Thomas. You've got guys that I know this is a little off topic, but it feels like a lot of times when guys achieve at Kansas, maybe the national view is okay. This guy achieved because somebody had to rush for yards at
Mm.
like it's not that this guy is actually that good. But
Yeah.
when you look at Kansas's running back room, there's only one 5-star running back in the Big 12 for this next year. It's Bijan Robinson at Texas. Everybody else was a 4-star below. And Kansas has three 4-star running backs, three guys who are, according to our recruiting analysts and everything, who look, primarily at talent and ceiling and all of those things. Kansas has three running backs who could play pretty much anywhere
Yep.
in Devin Neal and Kai Thomas, and then adding Savion Morrison from Nebraska. And I think, it's almost unfair even to cut it off at that, because talking to different people through the spring, there were some people who thought Daniel Highshaw looked as good as any of them. And Highshaw was a guy that was a high school quarterback, came to college, flipped to running back and was second on the team in rushing and had that 87-yard game against Texas Tech that almost helped Kansas to a win in Lubbock. And so when you look at the depth of that room, having four legitimate Big 12 backs and guys that are legitimately talented and potentially, in the right situation, could be getting looks in the NFL and different things like that. It's a different situation than what Kansas has been in at that position.
100%. And I think it fits into the identity I think this team is going to have this fall, where they're going to try and run the ball a lot. I think I mentioned this on past podcasts before, but it's going to be a little bit like Big Ten football, where they're going to try and shorten these games and really run the ball, try and play good defense. And that's why you saw so many defensive additions, right? 15 total over the course of the offseason between high schools, transfers, and JUCOs. And I think that the running back room is a really good example of that's your strength, lean on your strength.
Sure.
And that's what they're really going to try and do this fall with the running backs. I think you mentioning Daniel Highshaw is a really good point, because you look at what he did in his freshman season, right? Produced. And then all of a sudden last season has the injury, right? But then comes back, has a really good spring. And you're looking at Andrew Kotelnicki and what he does with the running back position, right? He's got the saying, a pair and a spare. Well, you've got a pair, a spare, and a spare. You know, like you've got 4 guys that over the course of a season, you'll be able to rely on in varying roles. And I'm really interested to see how they decide to do that, right? Are there going to be more 2 running back sets? Is someone like Sevion Morrison going to be used out of the slot at all? How are they going to move these guys around to try and lean on that strength so that you're not maybe having to lean on the wide receiver room, which I'm sure will come towards the near, or maybe not, maybe the end of the podcast. But moving to my first pick, second pick overall, I'm going to take the safeties room. I think you're looking at your 2 starters there, Kenny Logan and Marvin Grant. I'd argue probably one of the better safety tandems in the Big 12, right? Kenny Logan last year, the only safety in college football with 113 tackles, 6 pass breakups, and multiple forced fumbles. I mean, that's just incredible production from Kenny Logan. And I think this year, too, you look at this room, if Kenny Logan leads the team in tackles, I think that's a bad sign, because I think you're hoping someone like Marvin Grant can help take some of that off his plate. And for me, going into fall camp, I wonder, is Kenny Logan going to be playing closer to the line of scrimmage like he was last season? Or is the addition of Marvin Grant, who had 84 tackles and 2 tackles for loss last season, or is Marvin Grant going to be that guy that plays closer to the line of scrimmage, right? So you've got really good starters there. And then depth-wise, you add someone like Jarrett Paul from Eastern Michigan. He played corner at Eastern Michigan last season, has played some safety during his time in college as well. So we offer some versatility there as well. Of course, you got a guy like Jalen Dye, a junior college transfer you got from the West Coast. He'll probably be more of a special teams guy if I had to guess this year. And then, of course, you can't not mention O.J. Burroughs, who produced last year in his first season with the program. I wonder, too, does O.J. Burroughs maybe redshirt this year? You play him in 4 games, buy him an extra year at the back end of his eligibility while you have all these veteran guys at safety. So for you, Kevin, I guess maybe I hit all the boxes, but what stands out to you about the safeties room, and what maybe questions do you have heading into the fall?
No, I'm really glad you ended on O.J. Burroughs, because I feel like one of the things that's such a positive about this group this year is O.J. Burroughs and Jason Gilliam don't have to play, right? Like that's one of the main differences from last year. Those guys had 4 starts between them last year, and it's not that they can't play. It's not that O.J. Burroughs isn't going to be very good, or Jason Gilliam isn't going to be very good. It's that you don't want them to have to be when they're that young. You know, if a guy comes in and he's just, you know, an NFL guy right away and you have to get him on the field, that's one thing. But, you know, Aqib Talib came in as a safety and redshirted his first year, and then moved positions, you know, partway through the next year. And so even guys who are NFL guys, sometimes it takes them a little while to hit the ground. And when you look at, you know, Marvin Grant, when you look at Jarrett Paul, you know, as a guy who plays a different role and may kind of play that nickel corner safety, as somebody who's played both corner and safety in the past. Like you said, you know, Jalen Dye I thought was a really good pickup, in that he's not necessarily somebody you need to start this year, but he's somebody you might need to start in a year or two. And so bring him in this year. He learns the system. He does all of those different things. You know, I think the other thing that's kind of cool about this too is I loved Kansas's freshman class, like the guys who were incoming at safety. When you look at Caleb Purdy and Mason Ellis, you know, Caleb Purdy reminds me a lot of those Iowa State safeties that always get all Big 12 mention and are kind of all over the field. Mason Ellis, Kansas doesn't usually see 6'2" safeties that, you know, run in the mid 4.5s, you know, like Mason Ellis did last year going through the camp circuit and everything. And so you've got a guy in Ellis who has this frame to get big, right? He's 6'2", could wind up being a strong safety. You've got Caleb Purdy, who is sort of your classic center field, I feel like, free safety. You know, O.J. Burroughs is kind of that classic center field free safety. Edwin White Schultz is a guy that maybe would play a little closer to the box. And so you've got versatility, and you've got, even beyond the two deep, you've got young guys that can continue to develop there.
100%. Mason Ellis is your guy, isn't he? Like that. That's
I really liked him, and I liked him, coming out of his junior year. I understood because he had an injury. And so I think everybody kind of wanted to see him play, see him run around, see all of those different things. But he ran 4.41 at Sharp. He ran, I think, 4.43 at K-State, ran 4.49 at Kansas at 6'2" and 185 pounds. I mean, and that's not everything, but he backed that up on tape too. He played really well. And so when you look at a guy who can continue to develop his body, because he is kind of a skinnier guy right now, and all of those things, I do think Mason Ellis has a chance to be one of those guys that, 3 or 4 years from now, everybody's like, well, where did this guy come from? He's got all these terrific measurables. How did he wind up in this spot? And quite honestly, if he hadn't gotten hurt, I don't know that he wouldn't have been a consensus, top 5, top 10 guy in the state last year.
Definitely. All right. So for you, your second pick overall, third position group we're going to take here, right? Who are you going to go with?
At number 3 overall, I am taking the Fighting Jared Casey's, the tight end group. It's interesting because I know this is where we diverge a little bit. And I feel like 1 and 2, if you had the first pick, you were going to go running backs and I was going to go safeties and vice versa. But I think the tight end group, when you look at it, especially in comparison to other Big 12 tight end groups, the depth is so impressive. I mean, you have Mason Fairchild, who started quite a bit, came a really long way, I thought, as a blocker over the course of last year. I mean, you watched the early games, and Mason was struggling quite a bit more in those areas. You watch some of the mid-season and later games, and you're like, man, that was a really good blocking rep from Mason Fairchild. He's got good hands. Trevor Cardell was a kid I really liked out of high school because he was basically this big framed wide receiver who was going out and out running people. And you're like, well, he's going to be 50 pounds heavier when he plays in college. And so I was really interested to see what that looks like. And I thought Cardell had some really good moments. He had a good moment against Texas. He was a guy that got a little banged up, I think, at the end of the year. But even so, I thought he really came a long way. We all know about the Plainville assassin, Jared Casey, and what he did late in the year. The catch against Texas, if that was it, I think that we'd be like, oh, okay, he was the guy that made the catch against Texas. But then he goes out and makes a couple outrageous catches a touchdown in each of the next 2 games. And you're like, well, wait a minute, like where did this come from? And obviously, Casey's a walk-on or came into the program as a walk-on. But at the same time, he showed that on a Big 12 football field on Saturdays, he was somebody who was capable of making plays. Tavita Noah was a guy who was committed to TCU and really he went to their camp, did really well. I think ran around 4.7 flat was what Jeremy Clark said. So really good athlete with as big as he is, looks good physically. You've seen him. I mean, he looks the part. And then just to throw kind of the one last thing in there, Will Huggins had that really big spring game, last year's spring game right before Leipold and them took on it. And Huggins was another guy who was always kind of a bigger wide receiver as opposed to a classic inline tight end, which is what they want. Will Huggins on the roster is 255 pounds. So maybe, just maybe, I mean, there's crowded stuff in front of him, but maybe, just maybe, he's got the frame and the bulk and everything now to where he can start to show off as a blocker some of the things that he showed as a receiver.
Yeah, maybe. I think the thing that doing some research on the tight ends that shocked me was Trevor Cardell played the most snaps of any tight end.
Yep.
If you look at the Pro Football Focus snap counts, that surprised me.
Sure.
I thought Mason Fairchild was going to be that guy, and I think the blocking issues probably limited that. And for me, when I look at this group, the reason I didn't have him maybe higher is I still just wonder, is blocking-wise, are they good enough now? And overall, just I think talent-wise, are they at the level of some of these other position groups now where – I think Tavita Noah, you look what he brings, right? He looks like an offensive lineman, 6'4", 256.
A big dude.
huge dude. And you watch him in spring practice and you're like, that looks like an extra offensive lineman. He's going to help with that blocking stuff. But I just wonder some of these other guys, like, how are they going to fit in? So that's why I didn't have him that high, which allows me to take with the 4th overall pick, the linebacker room. That's a position. If we were doing this last year, this might have been bottom. If we're doing like a postseason,
I think last year it probably would have been my bottom if we're honest.
And now all of a sudden you look what they've done. You know, Chris Simpson deserves a lot of credit. The coaching staff, the recruiting staff, they all deserve a ton of credit for what they've done here, right? Where I wrote for our VIP subscribers on Sunday, you know, doing some expectation stuff. Like when Eric Gilliard committed in December, you thought, okay, this guy will probably start for you. Now all of a sudden you look what they did this year or in the spring, and you're like, okay, Eric Gilliard now all of a sudden is a really good backup.
Sure.
And that speaks to what this staff has done, where I think the guy that I am most excited to watch, hands down, second to none, is Craig Young. This is the type of guy that Kansas does not get. You know, you just look at his athleticism, right? He ran in the 4.5s at Ohio State. He says he's faster now than he was then. He's 6'3", 225, long arms. Like Brylan Borland got giddy when we asked him about him during spring practice. Like these are types of guys that don't go to Kansas, don't go to Buffalo, and yet Kansas now has one. And then you look at what you have in terms of the returning production, right? Rich Miller played, 80% of the snaps last year, 73 tackles, right? And so you look at him coming back, and he's probably going to start at will linebacker. And then at your Mike linebacker spot, you've got someone like Lorenzo McCaskill, who has played over 1,500 snaps of college football, was a part of that turnaround under Billy Napier at Louisiana, and of course has the connection with Chris Simpson because Buffalo was his first offer. And so there's already a relationship there, player and coach. McCaskill, you look at the pictures from the official visit. I mean, Kevin, you and I aren't jacked, right, by any means. But he makes both of us look like twigs, right? You see some of those photos that come out, and he just looks jacked. And so we'll see what happens, right? Being jacked like that is different than being in football shape. But I think you look at just top to bottom this room now. You go from last year where you really felt good about one linebacker being Rich Miller, Gavin Potter, so, right? Depends on who you talk to. They'll give you a differing opinion. And now all of a sudden you look at it, you've got a legit 2 deep if you include Tywin Berryhill there. And the question now, I think I brought up with the safeties, can you redshirt Tywin Berryhill? Because he hasn't used that redshirt yet. You've got enough guys under him, right? Think about someone like Cornell Wheeler, Krishan Brown as guys that maybe can step into that 6th linebacker role. So overall for me, I think I'm getting a steal here at, number 4 overall. I had them number 3 for me. So I guess for you, Kevin, like when I say linebackers, like what do you think of?
So I had linebacker number 6. The reason I had linebacker number 6 was just there are a lot of really interesting pieces, but very few that are proven at the University of Kansas.
True.
And I think when I was looking at tight end, I do agree. I think you have a lot of depth there for the tight end spot, but you don't necessarily have a guy that would jump out where you're like, that's an all Big 12 guy. Whereas I think that one of the things you look at linebacker, Lorenzo McCaskill, maybe an all Big 12 guy. And so I get it. McCaskill's a guy I'm incredibly high on. I mean, you go back and watch him at Louisiana, he was terrific. They played at Texas to open last year. I know our Texas people at 24/7, like the ones who walked around on the field, they felt like he looked like he belonged on that kind of football field, even with all those athletes and everything all around. And so you talk about Craig Young being a 10-6 100-meter guy, as a linebacker. And I know we talked about the safety spot and everything, and Paul kind of being maybe that nickel safety. I think that's a really interesting spot for Craig Young too, because Craig Young gives you the bigger option where you can basically play 3 linebackers and not lose athleticism when Young is that quote unquote nickel guy. I think Paul's the guy you tap into when you almost want a third corner out there at that spot. And so it is kind of an interesting deal. I know, Eric Gilliard is probably the most accomplished potential backup if he does wind up being a backup that just about anybody would have. Tywin Berryhill has a lot of ability, and people forget that he started 4 games last year. He was somebody that they thought maybe had a chance to do something. I really liked Krishan Brown out of high school. I know he hasn't played yet. He hasn't really gotten a chance to show that. I think there's some interesting physical ability there. He was small coming out of high school, so it was always going to take him a little while for the body to maybe catch up to the game a little bit. And then, like you said, the Cornell Wheeler kid, people forget about it because he transferred in from Michigan and then redshirted last year. And so when you're looking at this group and you're trying to hammer out the two deep, I feel like people don't even mention him because they don't think about him. But I mean, he's a guy that's got some ability too. So
Yeah.
I do think, like I said, I do think that I like linebackers' potential. And I think that if we redid this and say week 10, there's a chance that I would have linebacker higher.
Yeah.
But for me now, you know, I like Rich Miller a lot. I think that on some of Kansas's better linebacking groups in the 2000s, you know, Rich Miller would have maybe been like your number 3 guy rather than your no doubt number 1 guy. And so that leaves it maybe a little further back for me. But if Rich Miller continues to grow, and don't forget, like, he didn't even start the first 3 games of last year.
Yeah.
If he continues to grow and develop, and that's certainly there, if McCaskill plays up to his ability, if Craig Young plays up to his athleticism, this is a group that gets you pretty excited pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think I probably am. There's a lot of projection here with this one, but this is what I'm going to get out in front of, and I'll put my name on it right now. I got him for my pick. All right, for you now, let's move down. This is where I think things get really interesting because I think if you're sorting the roster into tiers, like you said, right, your safety and running back is in your tier 1, and then you kind of get into the second tier where it seems like there's a lot more. You can make arguments for either one. So for you, I think we're looking at this now. Your third pick, the 5th pick overall. Who are you going to take?
Yeah, I'm going to go with quarterback. You know, when I was going through, I wrote an article for 24/7 on the nation's best quarterback rooms, and the one thing that I found was that the really elite rooms that you really liked, they had a star quarterback, right? Like obviously, like you want to have C.J. Stroud or Bryce Young or Caleb Williams or whoever. The really good ones also had an experienced backup, right? And they had a quarterback that they were developing for the future that they really liked. Now, I'm not saying Kansas has like a top 10 quarterback room in the country, but I am saying, doesn't Kansas kind of fit that formula? Like, you look at Jalen Daniels, the way that he played at the end of the year. I mean, he's kind of the face of the program in a lot of ways right now. Jason Bean, you know, not only did he start for most of last year, he almost led KU to a win over Oklahoma. So it's not like he's a backup where if your quarterback has to go out for a play or two, you're like, oh my gosh, our program is dead. And then you look at Ethan Vasco. And part of the reason I like looking at Vasco is I think it's very instructive on the way this staff looks at quarterbacks. And when you saw them evaluating quarterbacks at camp last year, I know you had a little more of a chance to see them this year in the way they evaluated quarterbacks with the guys that they had come through camp and everything. They want a middle infielder for a quarterback, you know, somebody who can make the scoop, have quick hands, get the ball out, and can make throws from different arm angles as needed, right? Like if the play breaks down, the play's not done. And I think that Vasco is the kind of loose athlete that they really value in those spots. Somebody that can make plays off schedule, off rhythm. You know, when you do your 5-step drop and you're looking around and nothing's there and you need to extend the play, Vasco has a lot of that. He has a lot of that athleticism that plays up, the ability to make throws from different arm angles, the really loose, easy arm. And you know, Ben Easters was a guy that was probably a better fit under Brent Dearman, you know, because they did run so many RPOs at his high school. You know, he was familiar with the system and all of those things. And I'm not saying Dearman, you know, I'm not saying that Easters is going to, you know, yield that number 3 spot to Vasco. Like, obviously, if you're KU, you'd probably want a redshirt Vasco anyway. But I am saying that I think that Vasco is maybe the higher ceiling option when you look at that quarterback room moving on a little bit. But I got to read this for you real quick on Jalen Daniels, right? So ESPN put up this graphic at Big 12 Media Days, and you were down on the floor, but it showed it
Oh,
in Jalen Daniels' 3 starts, right, at the end of the Big 12 season. He was first in the Big 12 in touchdowns responsible for. He was second in the Big 12 in ESPN's QBR, which is their like weird quarterback rating thing. Second in the Big 12 in completion percentage, and he was third in just pure passing yards. And so when you look at that, I get, small sample size. I 100% get that.
hmm
It's 3 games. Some people would probably look at those games that they were against. Texas, not a great team. TCU had, parted ways with his coach, or him
yeah.
parting ways with them, however you want to put it. West Virginia was not a great team last year. And so I get that there are reasons to be a little bit hesitant about it, but I also think that that gives an indicator for just how well Jalen Daniels played over those 3 games, even if it was a small sample size.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day too, right? Those are the teams that KU needs to beat if
Sure.
they're going to take step forward, right? Whether it be getting a multiple Big 12 win season, you need to do that before you can even talk about bowl games, right? And so I think just for Jalen Daniels to do it against that competition, I still think is positive. You mentioned Ethan Vasco. I think the buzz on him has been undeniable. Now we'll see what it is when the pads come on and the bullets
Sure.
start flying at fall camp, right? That's a big caveat here. But I think seeing Vasco at camp, he does not look like an 18-year-old. There might be an 18 now, I'm not sure. But he does not look like he's 18 or 19 years old. Like he is ripped. And that was
Sure.
before really the full summer, right? We're talking mid-June
Yeah.
here. So they had all of July to do work with him too. So the buzz on him has been pretty positive. I think for me, like people aren't going to care, but the quarterback, the third string quarterback battles, what I'm interested in, for this position at fall
Sure.
camp, because I think we all know Jalen Daniels is the starter. We all know Jason Bean is the starter too, right? And so you look at the team overall and what this is going to lead to. You have a really good quarterback, and I think you look at the Big 12. Who do you take Jalen Daniels over, right? Like, I think you take him over Duggan at TCU. I'd take him
Sure.
over Adrian Martinez at Kansas State, I think. I think you take him over Deckers at Iowa State. I think he's not proven yet. And then Shook at TC or Texas Tech. Like, you've got a middle of the conference quarterback. Like, that's huge. And so
Sure.
I think overall you got to feel pretty good about the quarterback spot. And now this puts me in a tough position because now this is where I get into I can make an argument for and against any pick. And so I think for me, going into this, I kind of thought this is where I would be picking between defensive tackle and offensive line. And I'm going to take offensive line. And
That's right where I had him, by the way.
I just think that's where you have to go.
I,
And here's why.
I, I had him at 5. You're getting him at 6. So good value. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you look at the group, the staff feels really good about the 5 they have, right? You think about
Yeah.
Bryce Cabaldo at right tackle, Mike Ford probably playing left guard right guard, and then Mike Novitzy at center. And the guy I'm real excited to see this fall is Armaj Reed Adams. You
Yes.
look at the work that he has done, he deserves a ton of credit for the work that he has put in with the coaching staff, where he's lost 15 pounds. There's some photos up on Twitter that he tweeted of himself without a shirt on and looks just shredded. And for someone to be his size with his length and his weight now at 310 pounds to be that shredded, I think is incredible, especially where he came from in terms of his reporting weight. And then, of course, you have Earl Bostic, who is a middle of the road offensive tackle in the Big 12. And then
Sure.
for me, you look at the 5 and you're like, that is a good enough offensive line for KU, which when was the last time we said that? Right. They've had
It's been
Akeem
a while.
Adeniji, which was great, but he had, Oppie Maine and Adiago Lopeti next to him. Right. And it's just like, you look at the difference now where you feel good about the 5 you have. And you look at what they did last year, right? The fewest sacks allowed in the Big 12. Now, I point to, running the ball and that being an area for improvement, but your tight ends didn't block in the run game for half the season last year. So now you're hoping those guys take a step forward. The offensive line can take a step forward there. The question is depth. You've got one guy, really, DeAndre Dwallen, that you feel good about. Outside of that, it's a big question mark in terms of depth.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest concern when you look at this group is you feel like the starting lineup is pretty solid. Like you said, that it's mostly experienced guys. Reed Adams even has a start or two under his belt. The thing that I don't think a lot of people understand about Reed Adams was, he was 329 pounds when he showed up at a camp when he was at DeSoto High School. And he had, I think, a 7-foot wingspan there. And he ran a shuttle that was like an NFL lineman shuttle. And he ran it at 329. And so you look at a guy who comes in who gets up, closer to 400 pounds. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but I mean, he was right around there. When you look at a guy who does that and then puts in all the work that he does to get back down to 310, I think it's really exciting because you could see some of that quickness and everything pay off that made him an interesting prospect in the first place. I think you hit the nail on the head too with regard to depth, because that's what makes this the scariest position to pick in the draft. And I don't think, even if Jalen Daniels goes out and, knock on wood, steps in a 5-foot pothole and injures his leg tomorrow, you're going to be kind of okay with Jason Bean. If Devin Neal, trips over somebody's, Humvee or something, like walking down Mass Street, you've got other guys there. But the offensive line, we're really not sure, what that looks like outside of those top 5 guys. I mean, you're hoping Dominic Puny, maybe gets one of those interior spots, a guy who's coming up from Division II, Nolan Gorzica's kind of a swing guy, maybe a little bit. DeKedrick Stearns has kind of been on the 2 deep, but it's not really. Do you trust that guy to come in and start? If you have an injury, I really liked Joe Baker. Out of this last recruiting class, but he was like 250, 260 pounds in high school. He's not ready, and so when you look at that group, that's the one group that if you said, hey, you can sprinkle fairy dust and make one of these groups have perfect health for the whole season, it would be the offensive line. And so I do think that's such an interesting group. I think I really liked what Michael Ford showed at times last year. And I think that Bostic is a guy that maybe has an outside shot at all Big 12 honors. I don't think he's in that like main group, but he's somebody that's maybe just outside where he could be getting honorable mention next year. And I do think Nowitzki is going to be one of the best centers in the Big 12. And so that starting lineup, you feel pretty good about it as a group. And then after that point, you're just, it's the old Braves saying, when they had Warren Spahn and Johnny Sain and nothing else was, basically throw Spahn and Sain and pray for rain. And in this case, you've got 5 and you're hoping everybody stays alive, I guess, for a really bad rhyme at that spot.
Oh, that's going to show our age gap here. I have no clue who you're talking about. But
of course.
Let's use that as a segue here. Who are you going to take next? This is where I think things get real interesting. So who's up next?
Yeah, because you were talking about the defensive tackles, and this is exactly where I had the defensive ends at number 7. And so I'm going to take the defensive ends, and I can see you over there, throwing stuff. It's a good thing your arms aren't on camera. I saw you just clear off the entire table. So I think when I look at defensive tackle and defensive end, I think defensive tackle has more bodies. Like there's better depth there in terms of guys that I would feel good about going into the game. But I don't know that there's a defensive tackle that I like as much as Lonnie Phelps. I don't know that there is a number 2 defensive tackle, because you're talking about the number 2 defensive tackle potentially being Keenan Caldwell or Sam Burt. I don't know that I trust that person as much as I trust Malcolm Lee.
Okay.
And when you're looking at the upside options, I feel like at defensive tackle, there are a couple really good, upside options that I'm sure you'll get into next. And the ends and tackles were so tight for me. Like it was a really tough one. But I think that when you look at the upside options, I think I would feel better maybe about Davion Westmoreland, being a guy that climbs into the starting lineup and has an impact at some point during the season than I do about the young guys at defensive tackle. And so I think that's probably where it comes in. You have some other interesting guys. Jeremy Robinson's played a lot of football. He's had a couple good moments here and there. Zion DeBose, if he's healthy, maybe there's something he can bring to that group. You had the great write up on um, what to expect from the newcomers. It looks like Dean Miller is probably
Mm,
going to redshirt, but he's somebody for down the line. The
yeah,
other really interesting guy, I think, in this group, just because he's filling out well now, he's starting to put on weight. And while he was really raw coming in, I think we can all admit he had some athletic gifts, is Demarion
of
Alexander. And I'm
course.
not saying he's going to break into that group or anything like that. I'm just saying that if you're looking at this group and you build out the two deep, and there's somebody who's not on the two deep that you're like, hey, this guy could eventually be something someday if things work out. He's somebody there. And I think too, you look at how much Hayden Hatcher had to play early last year. And I think that this year there's a little more depth in that group where maybe that's not going to be as necessary. Nothing against Hayden. I do think that there's a little more depth this year than maybe what you had.
Yeah. So, all right. So, starting with the defensive ends, I'll kind of merge this in because I'll take
Sure.
defensive tackles with my pick. You have Lonnie Phelps, right? So, if you're going to rank, I think the two groups together, right? Lonnie Phelps would be at the top. I look second overall at Caleb Sampson for me, being the
Same.
second pick, and he's going to be your starter at one of those defensive tackle spots, I think. And I think those two are your top two at both spots.
Yep.
And then you get into that next tier, and just Malcolm Lee doesn't do it for me. I think for me personally, I
Sure.
just look for more production. That's for me my big thing with Malcolm Lee, right? I think he's a good player. He's played a ton of football, right? But I think you look at him last year, right? 23 tackles, 2.5 tackles for loss, and 1.5 sacks. And he played the sixth most snaps of anyone on defense.
Yep.
I'd like some more production if we're going to take that guy that high. Now, obviously, you can totally point the defensive tackles last year and them struggling. I think a change in scheme will help them this year. And again, this is
Sure.
another one where I'm projecting a little bit because you hear Lance Leipold talk about how they're going to play on edges more. And I think you heard the defensive tackles coach Jim Panagos talk about it during the spring too, of being more relying on athleticism. And so I think these guys will be able to play with more of a push up front this year. Obviously, I think Eddie Wilson's had a really strong spring and off season after he was a little bit banged up last year. And so I think for him getting back to 100% is a big deal. So I think you're probably looking at Wilson and Caleb Sampson being probably your two starters, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But then under him is where I think the depth maybe helps out a little bit more, where I think you look at defensive end, it's like, okay, Davion Westmoreland, right? You've got more of a range of outcomes with him.
Sure.
I think you could tell me by the end of the season he's starting. Cool, I could believe you. You could tell me by the end of the season he's redshirting. I believe you too, because you need
Yeah.
someone to be around for 2-3 years after this season. And so I'm not 100% sure with him. Dean Miller, not a huge factor this year, right? Big factor in 2023, just not this year. And so then you look at the defensive tackles group for me. You look at, the guys under there, right? Tommy Dunn, DJ Withers are two guys that come to mind there, right? Two younger players that I think will get some snaps this fall. And then you got Sam Burt, who I think has been around for a long time. Great culture guy, really good to have around the program, and a really good leader too. And so he'll be able to add depth there as well. So I think for me, the depth of the defensive tackles room is what puts them above defensive end for me. But honestly, this is one of those where flip a coin, and I think that's where you could go with, because the argument can be made either way. Any other thoughts on defensive tackles?
Yeah, it was super tight. I mean, choosing between those, it really was. I do think, Keenan Caldwell probably would be a perfect fit for what Les Miles and them wanted to do on defense. Like,
Exactly.
and I think that he's somebody that, he obviously, he started 6 of the last 7 games last year, but he's somebody that I could see sliding down a little bit this year with some of those guys. Um, Caleb Taylor is a
Yeah.
really interesting guy for me because his rise was so sort of ascendant where like people didn't really like think about him, and then he had the big spring last year, and then he's in a spot to start 4 games at defensive tackle when he came in as a defensive end. And so I feel like maybe Caleb Taylor doesn't get enough benefit of the doubt, like in terms of a guy who could wind up being, he's still relatively early on in his development. And so
Yeah.
some guys you look at him and you say, well, they are what they are. And I feel like some people think that about Caleb Taylor. and that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the two most talented tackles, are DJ Withers and Tommy Dunn. And when you obviously they're both extremely young. Dunn was a terrific job of the staff to kind of keep touch through all of that, because I know from talking to other staffs, there were some people who saw Tommy Dunn's film and they're like, for a 235, 240-pound kid, that's not that twitchy. Well, KU knew he was 270, 275 pounds while he was doing it. That makes a little bit of a difference in
Yeah,
terms
a
of how
little bit.
you evaluate somebody. And so it's interesting. DJ Withers was like an edge rusher in high school at 245 pounds and is now, I think, listed 292. And so when you look at those guys, it's funny. As much as I like Lonnie Phelps, and I would pick Phelps over Sampson, I think if you were to ask me what guy on the defense could sort of come off the page and become an All Big 12 guy, I might pick Caleb Sampson. I think that he potentially has that ability. The really interesting thing to me, and I think you kind of alluded to this too, with Withers and Dunn playing snaps, is how many snaps, right? Like, is it the tiny little bit here and there? Is it, hey, it's 3rd and 8 against Oklahoma and Kansas is still hanging around in this thing, and Tommy Dunn is on the football field? Like, and so I think that will really tell a lot about sort of where they're at in that defensive tackle group. But yeah, I think you have Sampson. I don't know who your second starter is, which is a little different from the defensive ends. You do have the young talent, but they haven't really played as much. And so it is kind of like linebacker. It is a pretty high upside group, I think,
Yeah,
as opposed to like where they sit now on, July 31st or whatever.
for sure. And final note on Caleb Taylor. I think he put on the most weight of anyone this offseason. I just looked it up, 43 pounds. Went from 257 to 300 pounds. Pretty big deal.
When I did that, nobody made a big deal about it, except, people telling me to, knock back on the Bud Heavies. But, that's the way it goes, I guess.
Yeah, well, we all can't put on a
Slightly
great
different,
lean
slightly
weight.
different 43 pounds, though, I'm guessing.
Yeah, just a little bit. All right, so for you, we're down to cornerback and wide receiver. Who are you going to take, and who am I going to get stuck with?
I'm going to take cornerbacks. Did you take wide receivers? Is that
No,
who you
I
did?
had cornerbacks ahead, but
Okay, yeah. So cornerbacks is kind of tough because it's really like the outside cornerbacks group, if you think about it, because they're the guys who will play, out on the edges, but the nickel spot will probably either be a safety or a linebacker a lot of the time. And so there aren't as many players, I feel like, as you're used to seeing at, cornerback or whatever, because that spot's going to come from somebody different. But
yeah,
you've got Keelan Gervin, who's played a lot of football and who I think is ready to step in and be pretty good. You bring in Monty McGarry, who's another, size frame guy that could potentially plug in and play. And then you've got a bunch of young guys that were sort of thrown to the wolves last year with various levels of success, right? So you've got Romello Dotson, 8 starts, Jacoby Bryant, 7 starts, Shad Dabney, 2 starts. And we were talking about this with safety and how the increased depth at safety means that OJ Burrows isn't going to need to be out there, as early as he was last year or in some of those same situations. And I think cornerback last year, really, those guys didn't have a chance to succeed that much because they were all young. I mean, even I think Dotson's the most experienced out of those guys. Even Dotson's heading into what, like his redshirt sophomore year, I think.
something like that. I'll have to pull it up.
But yeah, I mean, you look at those guys and even Dotson being the most experienced of those guys is somebody that you're still kind of hoping like, hey, I hope we have more experienced guys to put out there. But they're all players who have now started Big 12 games. They've been through a Big 12 season. Shad Dabney was a guy that every opposing coach that I talked to when he was coming out just glowed about how competitive that guy was on a snap by snap basis and just sort of the attitude that he plays with. Obviously, Jacoby Bryant made some huge plays last year. And when you look at them adding, late in the process, Brian Dilworth, the way that worked out,
Yeah.
I do think that the cornerback group has the chance to be significantly better than it was last year. But I still think that when you look at other positions, if Kalen Gervin's your top cornerback, I don't necessarily know that Gervin's an all Big 12 guy, where you at least see that in the range of options for like Caleb Sampson and Lonnie Phelps and some of the groups that we had before. And so I don't know that there's necessarily a star in that cornerback room, at least not for 2022. But I do think that it's a bunch of guys who have all of a sudden played quite a bit of football.
Yeah. I think for me, when I look at this group, there's a barometer here with fall camp that I have my eye on. Is Monty McGarry starting at quarterback?
Sure.
That's the question for me, because Kalen Gervin is going to start one of those spots, right?
Yep.
He's one of the leaders of the team. He's been a really great voice, I've heard, in the locker room in terms of pulling guys along and really holding that high standard that, Lance Leipold's talked a lot about player leadership. And it sounds like Kalen Gervin has been that in the locker room. Now, he's going to start. And the question is, who wins that other job? Is it Monte McGarry? Is it Jacoby Bryant? Is it really Mello Dotson or Shad Dabney? You look at the snap counts last year, Jacoby Bryant played the most out of those returning guys. He was second most of the corners behind Jeremy Webb. He played 417 snaps. Then Romello Dotson was next. He played 363 snaps. And then Shad Dabney played 170. So you're looking at Dotson playing almost double as Dabney. And when we went and talked to Jordan Peterson in the spring, he talked a lot about consistency for this group and who's going to be the most consistent. And he mentioned Shad Dabney having one of the more consistent springs. And so you bring in someone like Monty McGarry, who the staff told him, hey, you're going to have the opportunity to compete at corner. Now, you've also got guys like Jarrett Paul and Jalen Dye who have experienced at cornerback as well. So this group for me is really fascinating to see how the staff decides to use those versatile players that it does have. Because if they all of a sudden, if Jalen Dye is playing cornerback in midway through the season, I don't know what I'll think of that, right? Is that going to be a positive reflection on Jalen Dye as a player? Of course, because he's playing and he's earned that playing time. But also, what does that mean for the rest of this group? And so for me, like, I have him above wide receiver just because there's not as many questions as there are with that group.
Sure.
But I think just for me, cornerback, right, you've got one good starter there, but the question really is, who's that second starter and how much consistent play can they get from him? Because consistency was the issue last year. So, all right, let's get to wide receiver now.
Yeah.
Last. Why are they last? I think for me, you look up and down, who's the wide receiver one? That is the big question. You lose Kwame Lassiter, who I think had almost double the production of LJ Arnold and Trevor Wilson. You lose someone like that, that's massive. And I think the fact that LJ Arnold almost left the program, right? He tweeted he was going to enter the transfer portal, never happened. Katie convinced him to stay. The fact that he did that, and you take a look at the wide receiver room, what that would look like if LJ Arnold had left.
It was grim.
It's a scary proposition.
I did not actually mean to do that. I swear that was not
Kevin.
that was not a Luke Grimm. Oh my gosh,
that's great. We're keeping this in.
I'm spending way too much time with my dad and the bad puns and everything. My nephew actually has like a bad pun book or whatever because that was not even attempted.
That's funny. So
that unfortunately, and I'm sorry to your viewing audience, that just happened.
Well, we'll pay him back with a good take here. For me, Douglas Emilien is the name.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to see what he does. You talk to people around the program. Some say that he's got the most talent of anyone in the wide receiver room. Obviously, didn't play much at Minnesota last year, so this is purely a tape eval for the staff and relying on some past connections, whether it be Kai Thomas, who was his roommate at Minnesota, or other coaches that maybe have connections to the Minnesota program. So for me, at the end of the season, if you were to come and say, hey, Michael, who Douglas Emilien led the team in receiving yards, I'd say, okay, yeah, that does not surprise me. I think you can look up and down, though, just there are a lot of question marks of who's going to be the guy that emerges, right? Luke Grimm produced last year, but let's put this in perspective, right? LJ Arnold, 23 catches for 316 yards. Trevor Wilson, 27 catches for 364 yards. You just look at the production, and it's not a ton. And so you're asking a lot of these guys to have all of them take simultaneously a step forward, and while also integrating someone like Douglas Emilien. So for me, it's just it's the bottom position group because a lot of question marks of who's going to step up. You lost so much production, and now you're looking at this group saying teams are going to load the box against your running backs. Can one of these guys get open one-on-one? Douglas Emillion seems like the best bet for that. Maybe Luke Grimm second, but it's just a big question mark I have. So, well, what's kind of your read on the wide receivers?
Yeah. If you're looking for like a strong season for a wide receiver one, right? Like if you're projecting his stats out and saying, hey, we had a legitimate wide receiver one this year, the benchmark's usually 1,000 yards, right?
Mm-hmm.
1,000, 1,100 yards. How many touchdowns would you say? 5, 6, 7, something like that?
6, I think once every other game. It's fair.
Yeah. So this group, as an entire group last year, every single player in that group had 1,117 yards and 7 touchdowns. And that's a lot of players. Like,
Yeah.
and so I think you hit the nail on the head. And the number one thing that would help this group, it's not even necessarily that it's a bad group. It's that there needs to be a wide receiver one. There needs to be somebody that impacts the coverage of the defense, somebody that somebody has to actually game plan for, where they say, like, hey, don't let this guy get his catches. He can hurt you. And that helps everybody else in the passing game, including tight ends and running backs. And I think that that's what's kind of missing out of this group. Emillion didn't have a catch last year, at Minnesota. And I'm like you in that I'm about as big an Emillion fan as you can find out there. You watch his tape, and he's a really dynamic route runner. And what I mean by that is some guys just sort of inherently have it where, you see a 4-4 guy who can't get open, and you see a 4-6 guy who's open all the time. And it's a lot of times that he understands how to move his body, how to get open. And you see that with Emillion. You see the body control, the footwork, the way that he changes speeds, slows and accelerates, and all the different things that he does. When you watch him on tape, whether it's his high school tape, whether it's the Minnesota practice tape that he put out, and you kind of see him and everything, you see that he is a really good route runner who excels at getting open. And if he can be the number one wide receiver in this group, that changes this group a lot. If he becomes a legitimate not just a guy who's wide receiver one because you have to have one, but a guy who's legitimately, people look at him and they're like, well, Jalen Daniels throwing to Douglas Emillion is tough to stop. And I think LJ Arnold has wide receiver one potential, but I also think, when we rank guys, like, right, you, myself, and Ryan Wallace over at Go PowerCat, we talk a lot about our ranking process. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is we don't just look at a guy's ceiling. We look at how likely he is to get there as well. And there are a lot of different factors in that. LJ Arnold's 6'3" with a 22.5-foot long jump. Like, he's big, he's athletic, he has those different things. And so you really want to see him take that next step where he's not just somebody that looks good coming off the bus, that, runs around really well out there, but somebody that on 3rd and 7 people fear. And I think that that's the step that he needs to take. And he had some good moments last year. I mean, I don't know that they win the South Dakota game without him, and the way he played that. And I think that when you look at him this year, that's the step forward you want to see from him, even if he's not wide receiver one, but he becomes that guy that he has the potential to become. I think that makes this room a lot better too. And then after that, Trevor Wilson can really run as one of the fastest guys in the program. Luke Grimm, I think Kansas recruited him initially as a safety and then flopped him to receiver. And one of the things that we always kind of talked about was this guy's going to play early because you're going to have to play him, not because you don't have other guys, but because he's going to be too good. Like, you're not going to be able to leave him on the sidelines, even if you look over and you're like, man, this guy doesn't look as good physically as some of our other guys. When it comes down to it, he gets open and catches the ball. And so you've got that. And I know, you have a different wide receivers coach. I also know Emmett Jones, from talking to him when he was at Kansas, was high on the ability of Stephen McBride. He was high on the ability of Tanaka Scott and Keelan Robinson. And so McBride is going to play. He's going to be in that rotation. But I think that something that will also be interesting to watch is Tanaka Scott is now, I think, 205 pounds at 6'4". Can he be a downfield threat? Somebody that if you get one-on-one coverage, you feel good throwing it up to him. Keelan Robinson was more polished than Tanaka Scott was coming out. Can he break into sort of that top group? And things like that could help this group out a little bit too.
Definitely. So to wrap up here, Kevin has the running backs, quarterback, the tight ends, and defensive end, and then the cornerback group. And I have the wide receivers, offensive line, defensive tackle, and linebackers and safeties. I feel pretty good about my group.
I like my group too. I got to pick first though, so it's like I should feel good about my group. Otherwise, I screwed this whole thing up. But yeah.
Yeah. So all right. So for you then, let's talk about some expectations before we get out of here real quick.
Sure.
For you, what should the expectations be? Because for me, I think you look at this transfer class and I think it helps you close the gap in terms of competitiveness. Does this get you over the hump to winning multiple Big 12 games for the first time in over a decade? I don't think so. I think you're still looking at this roster being in a place where can it be competitive in a lot of games? Yes. Is it good enough to get over the hump and beat some of these Big 12 teams? I'm not 100% sure yet. I think for me, when I look at the win total this year, I think it's set at 2.5. I do kind of like the over. I think 3 wins is probably where this team ends up. But I think any talk of 5-6+ wins, I think is out of pocket. For you, like range of outcomes, expectations, where should those be for fans this fall, in terms of just you being realistic?
Top half of the bit. No, just so here's my thing. Like I want to give you a direct win answer, but I really think it depends on September because Kansas has Tennessee Tech and you've got Duke, which are 2 very winnable games. Like I'm not saying Kansas should beat Duke because I think we can safely say over the last 12 years, you can't really point to a single game and say Kansas should win that game. Yeah. But I do think that there's a very real possibility that Kansas could be favored in that game or will be favored in that game, especially with Duke, new coaching staff, all of those different things. And so when you look at those 2 and you look at the game at West Virginia, now West Virginia is, if you take Kansas out of the equation, West Virginia would be my pick to finish last in the Big 12. And I get that it's at West Virginia. I think that we can sit here and say, yes, it was 1 game, and you hate to draw conclusions off of 1 game. Kansas played with West Virginia pretty well in the season finale. Kansas had no running backs for that game pretty much. Devin Neal did not play. And I think that even though West Virginia went and got JT Daniels this offseason, I think you could pretty easily make the argument that Kansas improved its roster more this offseason than West Virginia did from where they were at in November. And so when you look at that, I see the possibility of 3-1. At that point, I think it would be disappointing if you went 3-9. I agree with you. I do like the over. I think that if you come out of September 2-2, like we all, like most people probably expect, or Kansas people probably expect, I think it's fair to say that it could be 3-9. But I do think if you come out of September at 3-1, where you already have a win in your only Big 12 game so far, I think 4 is on the table. I really do. Whether that comes against an Iowa State team that's, has a lot of really good young talent. I think not a lot of people realize that.
No.
Iowa State is going to be significantly better, I think, in November than it is in early October. Whether you have a chance to do it against, say, like Texas Tech, new coaching staff, they've got a 3-way quarterback battle right now, which different things can happen. TCU, nobody really knows because of the way last year ended and all of those different things. Another place where you have a legitimate quarterback battle. And so I'm not saying Kansas is going to be favored in any of those games. I'm just saying if Kansas comes out of September 3-1 with the confidence that would come
Yes.
with going 3-1, I think you can make a case that Kansas is going to be in play for 4 wins at that point.
Yeah, and talking to some program sources, it sounds like that not necessarily the wins, but can you have that confidence and belief coming out of September? Because that schedule is so hard on the back half. It is
Sure,
so hard. You play Baylor, Oklahoma, Texas, Oklahoma State, all within kind of a very condensed stretch. Where I think in reality, I think if you're KU, you almost want some of those games early in the season because you can kind of take your lumps, and this staff has shown that they will improve over the course of a year. But to have those in kind of the crunch time part of the season is tough. I look at the West Virginia game being that litmus test for this season.
sure. I agree.
I think, we talked to Shayon J. Raja last week, and he talked about West Virginia and the fact that they played two rivalry games.
Yep.
KU sandwiched right in between those two. So if all of a sudden, if Neil Brown and the West Virginia team loses the first game of the season against Pitt on that Thursday, are they down? And then do they think, okay, well, we can just go beat Kansas, or are they coming in like, no, we have to go in and just blow out Kansas? Like, what mentality do they come into that game with? And so I look at that game being a big barometer, but I look at the schedule. You're
Yeah,
playing 11 Power 5 teams. That's the reality of what you're doing,
sure,
right? Tennessee Tech is the only non-Power 5 team you're playing. Houston is a Power 5 team. They play in the AAC, but that roster Power 5. They're going to be
sure.
in the Power 5. What is it, next season? So overall, I think you're looking at this schedule does not do KU any favors. I think that for me, I will measure success this season on the competitiveness. Can
Sure.
KU put a
Same.
competitive product on the field 9 out of the 12 games? That will be how I measure success, not the wins, because I think this roster is still in a place where it has these transfers now, but it's just not a place where I think it's going to be competitive or good enough to get the wins. Be good enough to be competitive, but maybe not get the wins. So, Kevin, I'll give you the last word. Any final thoughts on KU before we get out of here?
No, I actually thought that was a great way to describe it. I think that when we look back at year one, the Texas game is what everybody brings up, especially from like a national perspective
For
and
sure.
everything. But I think that when you look at it from a Kansas perspective, it probably started earlier than that. You saw flashes in the Oklahoma game. The Texas game was impressive in the way that went. Kansas was up at halftime against Duke, and just didn't have the depth. But I also think too, they were still putting in half a playbook, at that
Yeah.
point because they hadn't been there for the spring. And so when you look at the jump potentially from year one to year two, guys knowing where they're going, them not having to put in systems on the fly while also trying to decide, hey, can this guy even play at this level? You're deciding personnel stuff at the same time as scheme and trying to adjust to all those. And so when you add all of that together and the way that they close the game or close the year, I do think that competitiveness is going to be what we look at. And it's funny because it's not, improvement isn't linear. You don't just, it's automatically you're at this point, and so you're going to take a step up, and you're going to take a step up. And in Mangino's second year, Kansas went 6-6 and then went to the Tangerine Bowl and lost it. They were probably a better team in 2004 and went 4-7. They had a top 10 defense, I think, nationally. They played a lot of close games, but the close games didn't come out their way. And so you slump back and wind up only winning 4 games. Remember, that was the game where they lose to Texas in the final 30 seconds when Texas had Vince Young and went on to win a BCS game. And so when you look at all of that, I think it's very easy for people to look at it and say, okay, like Kansas was close last year, just turn those close losses into wins. The reality is that it's a little more incremental than that. And that sometimes, it doesn't work out quite that way where you're going from close games to close wins. Sometimes it goes the opposite, where maybe you've got a more close games next year, but they go against you. But I do think that you look at the competitiveness specifically, and you referenced this earlier, against the teams in the Big 12 that Kansas is going to need to compete with to be a top half of the Big 12
Yes.
program. And not just this year, but going forward. And so look at where they're at. Kansas doesn't need necessarily, if you think Baylor is the best team in the Big 12 this year and Baylor was the favorite in the media poll, it's not that Kansas needs to play Baylor and lose 21-17. But how's Kansas playing against Texas Tech that's starting over with a new coaching staff? How's Kansas doing against Iowa State, which is in a transition year as some of those younger guys kind of get up to speed? How's Kansas doing against West Virginia, against TCU? How's Kansas doing against Kansas State? Because I think we've seen, over the course of that rivalry, it's not that they've never both been good at the same time, but they're almost never consistently good at the same time. And so if Kansas takes a big step against Kansas State and, makes the Wildcats sweat that game out in Manhattan, it might be another loss where you say, oh my gosh, they're adding to the streak, et cetera. But it might also be the sort of thing where you come away and you say, okay, maybe the gap's shrinking a little bit at the same time.
Perfect. That's a great way to wrap it up, Kevin. Thanks a bunch for jumping on the podcast. Excited to do more of these this fall with you. For anyone looking to read Kevin's stuff, you can do it on 247sports.com and all over a lot of the Big 12 pages. Kevin does a lot of work with the Big 12 as well. And as always, if you enjoyed listening to the Fog.net podcast, please leave a rating and review on iTunes. If you're watching this on YouTube, we have the podcast on Apple, Spotify. And if you're listening on Apple, Spotify, or any one of those platforms, check out our YouTube channel as well. It's called The Fog, Kansas basketball and football coverage. Thanks a bunch, Kevin, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Mike.